Micah Langston sat frozen as the dean slid a letter across the table. Not a diploma but an expulsion notice. Moments ago the crowd outside had chanted his name like a hero. Now, Harvard claimed he compromised academic integrity, but Micah had receipts, and one audio file the university never thought he'd find. The question wasn't if he'd fight back, it was how many would fall when he did. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The lecture hall at Harvard's Warren Academic Building was known for its cold air conditioning and even colder silences. That morning, the stillness was thick. The kind of quiet that crept over students not out of respect but dread. 200 undergraduates, grad students, and a few ambitious visiting fellows sat in rows, their fingers on laptop keys and eyes forward. Professor Charles Reeds was a man who filled space like smoke, subtle, suffocating, and impossible to ignore. He stood at the front of the room, his tailored navy blazer and pressed white shirt as stiff as his posture. Reeds wasn't the kind of professor who warmed a room with welcome. He sharpened it. Harvard knew him as a tenured academic titan, but among students of color, especially those with disabilities, he was something else entirely: untouchable, intimidating, and quietly dangerous. Micah Langston, 23 years old, and one of only 3 black graduate students in the lecture hall, sat near the back. His wheelchair, always neatly aligned with the desk edge, bore scuff marks from years of use, each one a silent record of battles fought. He was used to the glances, the subtle hesitations when others had to move aside to let him pass. But today, he felt a shift, a pressure. The air had thickened, and Reeds hadn't even said anything yet. "Before we begin," Reeds said, his voice clipped and cutting through the silence, "I'd like to address something." The words hit like a warning bell. Micah looked up, eyes alert but unreadable. "Mr. Langston," Reeds continued, now walking toward the back of the room, "I hope you understand that advanced discourse requires more than just attendance. It requires capability, commitment, cognitive endurance." A murmur passed through the class. Micah blinked once, steadily. Reed stopped beside him. "You may find it difficult to keep up given your circumstances." No one breathed. No one moved. Micah didn't flinch. Reed smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. "This isn't a space for sentiment. Harvard has standards, and if you find that your condition impedes your ability to meet them, perhaps this isn't the place for you." The silence ruptured into discomfort. Some students shifted in their seats, while others stared down at their screens, pretending they weren't witnesses. A few looked at Micah, pity in their eyes. A few more, agreement. Micah stared straight ahead, his jaw tense. Then slowly, calmly, he closed his laptop. The snap echoed in the room. He met Reed's gaze, not with fear but with something unreadable. Not defiance, not surrender, something else. Reeds expected a rebuttal. He welcomed it. It would give him something to crush. But Micah said nothing. Instead, he reached down to his bag, pulled out a slim, leather-bound notebook, and opened to a blank page. His fingers moved slowly, deliberately, writing something down with a black pen. He didn't speak, didn't argue, just wrote. Reeds narrowed his eyes. "Is there something you'd like to share with the class, Mr. Langston?" he asked, sarcasm coating every word. Micah paused, lifted his pen slightly, and looked up. "No, Professor. I'm just taking notes. For later." The tension rose. The moment was loaded. Reed smirked, as if to dismiss the comment, but something in his jaw tightened. He turned back toward the front, pacing with the unease of someone who'd been publicly resisted, but not attacked, and that unsettled him more. The lecture continued. Technically, Reeds talked about legal frameworks, judicial history, and precedent, but no one was listening. Not really. Eyes kept drifting back to Micah, the student who didn't flinch, the student who quietly wrote while being humiliated. After class, whispers chased Micah through the hallway like shadows. "Did you hear what Reed said to him? I mean, he does make things harder for the TAs." Still, it was cold, even for Reeds. Micah ignored them all. He moved silently through the halls, the rhythm of his wheels oddly soothing against the marble. But inside, he wasn't calm. He was calculating. Back at his dorm, Micah opened his laptop again. He scrolled through his files until he found a folder labeled Reed's Compliance. Inside were screenshots, emails, and notes, carefully time-stamped, meticulously organized. He had been building it for months, waiting, watching. He never planned to use it, Not unless he had to. Today had changed that. He clicked into an email Reeds had sent last semester, responding to Micah's request for an extension, after a medical emergency. Reeds' reply was short. This university cannot accommodate weakness under the guise of fairness. Consider if you are truly a fit. He attached it to a new draft email. The recipient, Sierra Morrison, third-year law student, former intern at the ACLU, and his friend. Subject line, need your eyes on this. Urgent. He hovered over the send button. For a long time. Then he clicked. And somewhere across campus, a different kind of storm began to stir. Micah doesn't argue. He calmly closes his laptop. But what he does next shocks everyone. Micah Langston wheeled out of the lecture hall, as if the air behind him had caught fire. The stares still burned, not from pity but from quiet judgment, the kind that smiled in your face and erased you behind your back. He didn't need to hear them whisper to know they were. Harvard had its own language for people like him. It wasn't loud. It didn't shout racial slurs or call attention to disability. It was polite racism, dressed in prestige, softened with fake concern, and sharpened behind closed doors. He passed a group of students chatting casually in the hallway. Their eyes followed him for a moment, long enough for him to feel it. The pause in conversation, the half-second of performative silence, then the laughter resumed. He kept moving. The truth was, Micah's fight had started long before that morning's public humiliation. His disability was visible, but his isolation was not. As one of the very few disabled black graduate students on campus, he wasn't just navigating a curriculum. He was surviving a every class, every seminar, every peer interaction was layered with coded signals. Faculty praised him as inspiring when he didn't ask for extensions. Students glanced nervously when group work was announced, silently praying they wouldn't be paired with the diversity kid in the chair. What they didn't see were the nights Micah spent alone in his dorm, typing with tired hands, his back aching from hours in the same position, trying to finish readings that were already inaccessible to his screen reader. Harvard's commitment to inclusion, it turned out, was more of a pamphlet promise than a lived reality. Accommodations existed on paper, but in practice they were gate-kept bureaucracy, and too often denied under the guise of academic integrity. Even his scholarship, the one that paid for his housing and meals, came with strings. It required he maintain a GPA above a certain threshold, while also contributing to campus DEI panels and mentoring undergrads. The unspoken trade-off was clear. In exchange for access, he had to become a symbol. It was a deal he had never signed but was forced to honor. By midweek, word of the classroom incident had begun to spread beyond his program. It started with vague posts on student forums. Did anyone see what happened in Reed's class? Followed by a heated thread on an anonymous campus board, where users questioned whether students with extra needs were dragging down academic standards. Some questioned whether Micah had earned his place at all. That phrase, earned his place, clung to him like a curse. It wasn't new. It had followed him from high school, through his undergraduate years, and now echoed louder than ever in the marble halls of Harvard. He remembered every counselor who assumed he needed special help, every admissions officer who looked surprised when he listed his AP scores, every professor who complimented him for being so articulate. They didn't see the hours he'd poured into getting here. The late nights, the pain, the medical setbacks, the lectures he had to listen to 3 times because the audio distorted through assistive tech. All of it invisible, and all of it dismissed the moment someone decided he was lucky to be here. Micah had learned early to keep receipts, not just emotionally, but literally. Every email, every syllabus, every form. His hard drive was a vault of records. At first it was simply a coping mechanism. But now it was becoming something more, something dangerous. He opened a file labeled Hostility Archive, a quiet project he had started after his second month in Reed's class. Inside were notes he'd taken on every time the professor made coded comments in lectures, every time he dismissed a student's question, unless it came from a white male, every time he made an example out of Micah under the veil of academic rigor. One entry stood out now, an email exchange from weeks ago that had slipped under the radar. Micah had requested a syllabus adjustment after a hospitalization related to his chronic nerve condition. The professor had responded with what at the time seemed cold but legally safe, a refusal masked in academic jargon. But Micah reread it now with sharper eyes. Buried in the second paragraph was a sentence that, in context, revealed more than Reeds may have intended. It wasn't just a refusal, It was a challenge to his presence. A suggestion that accommodations were equivalent to a lowered bar. A subtle accusation that his disability was a performance. And that was the line. It hit him not just as an insult, but as an erasure. Reeds hadn't denied the accommodation. He denied his legitimacy. It was precisely what he had done, in the lecture hall. Only now, Micah had it in writing. He hovered over the email. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. The file was damning, not in a scandalous headline-grabbing way, but in a quietly corrosive one. It revealed the very thing institutions like Harvard tried to deny, that discrimination didn't have to be shouted to destroy someone. It could be done with clean language, Ivy League polish, and a signature at the bottom of a polite email. Micah's mind moved quickly. He thought of Sierra Morrison, the law student who had interned with a civil rights organization the summer before. She had told him once, in passing, to let her know if he ever needed help navigating the hidden battles. He had never followed up. He had wanted to fight alone. But now, the weight was shifting. The humiliation had become a spark. What had begun as survival was turning into strategy. He opened a new message and attached the email thread. The subject line was simple. Reed's incident. This feels like a pattern. His finger hovered over the send button. Again, he had sent things to Sierra before. Articles, jokes, invitations. But never this. Never something that might ignite a legal storm. He hit send. And for a moment, the room felt still. Then his phone lit up. Not a reply, not a call, but a new email from an anonymous Harvard address. No subject, no name, just one line in the body. You think you're ready. You're not. Micah forwards that email to a law student friend. And what she finds could bring Reeds down. The email sat like acid in Micah's inbox. No name, no header, just that single, cryptic sentence. You think you're ready. You're not. He stared at it for a long time, heart steady but heavy. It wasn't fear he felt. It was clarity. This wasn't just about an email anymore. This was war, and someone out there had declared it first. Within 24 hours, the real attack began. It started online, quiet at first, like the drip of a faucet behind a wall. A post on a Harvard-exclusive forum, with a title designed to provoke without violating rules. Let's talk about fairness. Inside, a long-winded complaint about academic standards being lowered to meet representation goals. No names, but the implication was surgical. The second post wasn't as subtle. It directly referenced the Reed's classroom incident, but distorted the narrative. According to the poster, Micah had been hostile, entitled, and had disrupted the class with a political stunt. Within hours, the thread had hundreds of replies. Most rode the middle line, hiding bigotry behind the language of meritocracy. Some were openly cruel. Micah's name was never mentioned, but it didn't need to be. Screenshots of the thread started appearing in group chats. Someone leaked an edited clip of the lecture. The original footage, which Micah hadn't even known existed, had been cropped to remove Reeds' opening comments and focused only on Micah closing his laptop and scribbling something in his notebook. Paired with the professor's statement about commitment, the caption read, "When diversity backfires." It spread like wildfire. By Thursday, a subreddit dedicated to Ivy League discourse had picked it up. A comment under the top post read, "This is what happens when you admit people based on feelings, not standards." It had nearly 2,000 upvotes. Micah sat in the back corner of the library, hunched over his laptop. He hadn't spoken to anyone all day. Not even Sierra. Not even to himself. The digital weight pressing on his back was heavier than anything he'd felt physically. He wasn't just fighting the narrative. They were rewriting it around him in real time. What cut deeper than the posts were the looks. Real ones. In the hallways. In dining spaces. On elevators. The silence had changed. It was no longer pity or discomfort. It was curiosity, suspicion, and sometimes, thinly veiled satisfaction. To them, he wasn't Micah Langston anymore. He was the symbol in a meme. The disabled black kid, who made a scene. But Reeds? He remained untouched. In fact, he seemed energized. That week's lecture was colder, crisper, delivered with an unmistakable confidence. He was no longer cautious in his jab. Every comment about entitlement, toughness, and preparedness came with a glance in Micah's direction, never long enough to be quoted, but always sharp enough to leave a mark. Micah stopped taking notes in class. Instead, he started watching. Reeds was using him as an example, not in syllabus content, but in posture. His presence had become a warning, Don't challenge the system, or you'll become the story. Micah's confidence faltered. For the first time since coming to Harvard, he considered stepping back, taking medical leave, leaving the program entirely. But that thought collapsed the moment he opened his encrypted drive. The receipts, the archive, the truth. Buried in one of the older folders, he found something he hadn't revisited in months. An anonymous survey result from a DEI student feedback form. The responses had been compiled into a spreadsheet, and though they were labeled anonymous, some comments were specific enough to identify people. One in particular jumped out at him. There's a pattern of intellectual dismissal for students who challenge Professor Reed's, especially women, especially black students. I know. It happened to me. Former JD student. Micah hadn't seen it before. Or maybe he had, but hadn't understood its weight until now. A quick search through archived class rosters and student orgs led him to a name, Jordan Elmore, former Harvard law student. She had disappeared from the campus radar in 2019. No graduation photos, no LinkedIn, no mention in alumni records. She had vanished. Micah found an old blog she had written during her first year. The last post, dated spring of 2019, was a short note about stepping away for health reasons. There were no comments, no reply, but one line in the post haunted him. Sometimes silence is survival, and sometimes it's a prison. He had to find her. It took 2 days, 5 message boards, and a tip from Sierra, but he tracked down a private Facebook group for Black Harvard alumni. She was listed as a silent member. No posts, no public activity, but she was there. Micah wrote a message. He didn't explain everything, just enough to say he understood, and that he needed to talk. He didn't expect a reply, but she responded within an hour. They met in a small cafe, miles off campus, far from the brick walls and ivy charm. Jordan looked older than her photos, not in age but in weight, like she had carried something for years that had carved lines into her. She didn't smile when she saw Micah. She just nodded. The meeting was quiet, heavy. She confirmed it quickly. Reeds had tried to ruin her too. She had challenged his grading, called out a pattern of dismissal in class participation. The backlash was fast, cold. Within a semester she was on academic probation for non-compliance with course expectations. Her attempts to report him were rerouted. Eventually she was told by a senior faculty member that some things aren't worth the fight. So she left. She hadn't told anyone. She'd never gone public. She was scared and tired. But seeing Micah, knowing someone else had survived long enough to fight, her voice cracked. She told him she still had the documents, emails, meeting notes, a letter from the dean's office that implied ongoing issues, but refused to name Reeds directly. Micah asked for them. She hesitated. Then she handed him a USB drive, plain, scratched, but packed with silence, turned into evidence. As she stood to leave, she placed a hand on his shoulder. Her only words, "If you're going to do this, finish it." Micah sat there long after she left. The USB drive burned cold in his palm. He plugged it into his laptop. One of the files was a PDF attachment. Its name recommendation letter Reed's draft. Inside, a paragraph read, "While the student displays passion, she often conflates advocacy with scholarship. This lack of objectivity impairs her academic growth." Micah scrolled to the top. The letter had never been sent, but it was signed by Charles Reeds. Micah tracks down the former student, but what she reveals changes everything. The files Jordan handed over were not just evidence, they were breadcrumbs. Every letter, every note, every refusal to name the professor in writing was more than just a pattern. It was policy disguised as paperwork, and it forced Micah to see something even more devastating. This wasn't just about him. It never had been. By the end of that weekend, Sierra Morrison was fully involved. Inside Micah's dorm, the two sat shoulder to shoulder in front of a single laptop. A makeshift wall of coffee cups and unopened ramen cups framed their workspace. Sierra's legal training gave her the ability to read between the lines of administrative neutrality. Where Micah saw polite language, she saw strategic shielding. Where he saw bureaucratic coldness, she saw a wall of intentional misdirection. The deeper they went, the wider the trail became. Jordan wasn't an anomaly. She was one of many. With access to archived student forums, now mostly dormant, Sierra pulled up an old thread from 2014. It was anonymous, the way most whispers of dissent had to be back then. The post talked about a professor who punishes students for being the wrong kind of ambitious, and a law course where you learn to disappear. A second post, dated months later, mentioned a wheelchair student who transferred out after only one semester. No name, no follow-up. But the language was hauntingly familiar. Micah leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. The same language used on him. The same tactics, same erasures. They compiled names and references, moving chronologically. Reeds had taught at Harvard for nearly 17 years. In that time, dozens of students had quietly withdrawn from his courses mid-semester. Some transferred departments entirely. Some left the university. A few had tried to file complaints, but not one had succeeded in getting a formal investigation launched. What they found in Harvard's digital archives, those available to the public, was a perfectly clean record. Reeds had never been reprimanded, never disciplined, never even flagged. Sierra's face hardened as she scrolled through the ethics board site. "This isn't oversight," she whispered. "This is intentional." They dug deeper. Harvard's internal complaint system was confidential, but Sierra remembered that certain student government bodies had kept unofficial archives of DEI incidents. Most were password protected or purged annually, but one former DEI committee chair had published a year-end PDF years ago, buried inside an outdated webpage from the university's diversity symposium. In it was a table of faculty members with more than 3 concerns raised. One of them was CR Law Dev. Micah felt the blood drain from his face. There was no full name, but the rest of the table gave him no doubt. The line noted repeated complaints about classroom hostility, refusal to accommodate, and demeaning language targeting students from historically marginalized groups. All of the cases had been marked the same way, resolved internally. Micah's voice stayed calm, but his eyes burned. He asked Sierra what that phrase meant in legal terms. She didn't answer immediately. She simply opened a new document and typed one sentence: "Resolved internally, buried and forgotten." It wasn't that no one had spoken out before. It was that every voice had been professionally silenced, institutionally ignored, or academically punished. Micah scrolled through emails from former DEI chairs who'd tried to push policies requiring professors to attend bias training. Every attempt was labeled under review. None had been implemented. Even the current DI office webpage featured a banner about inclusive excellence, but the complaint link redirected to a broken page. Micah stared at the screen, heart pounding. This wasn't a broken system. It was a system working exactly as it was designed. The deeper they went, the darker it got. Sierra suggested filing a FOIA-adjacent request, a legal nudge designed to force internal data into the open. Micah drafted the request under the university's public interest research clause, framing it as part of a study into the effectiveness of bias reporting systems. Within 48 hours they got a reply: "Your request has been forwarded to the appropriate department." A delay tactic. Micah expected as much. But then something unexpected happened. A reply came not from the public interest office, but from an unnamed administrative assistant in the dean's office. The message was brief: "I can't say anything, but look under your student portal. You'll find a folder that shouldn't be there." Micah logged in. There, buried beneath the usual tabs for financial aid and housing, was an unmarked folder. Inside it was a single document titled Advisory Review Notes, Confidential. He opened it. What he found wasn't just shocking, it was surgical. The document was a staff-only review of several student incidents flagged under a sensitivity watch. One entry read, "Student with recurring accommodation requests, perceived to be activating grievance culture. Consider future guidance under quiet withdrawal suggestion." There was no name, but the date matched the same week Micah had filed his medical extension. Another entry, even more chilling, referenced students from past cohorts, listing them only by the first initial of their last name. Law 2019. Unable to integrate into traditional academic expectations. Faculty notes cite overconfidence and inflexibility.
That was Jordan.
The pattern was grotesque in its subtlety. Every reference avoided race, disability, or identity. Instead, they used professional euphemisms to construct a paper wall between discrimination and documentation. It hit Micah like a wave. Harvard didn't erase you openly. It adjusted your narrative, just enough to make you disappear in plain sight. Sierra stared at the screen in silence. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but rage. Micah didn't say a word. He copied the file, encrypted it, and backed it up 3 times. The weight in his chest felt heavier than anything he'd known before. This wasn't about Reeds alone. He was just the face of something older, colder. The institution had mastered the art of protecting itself, and it had left a trail of brilliant, broken students behind. He remembered something Jordan said in the cafe. Sometimes silence is survival, and sometimes it's a prison. Micah had lived in that prison long enough. Now he had the key. He began drafting a strategy, not just legal, but public. Reed's was powerful, yes, but Harvard feared one thing more than lawsuits: reputation collapse. He and Sierra organized every file, every email, every report. They created timelines, linked student names, and cross-checked resignations, transfers, and mental health withdrawals across nearly a decade. There were names, there were patterns, there were cover-ups, all hidden behind polished banners and smiling diversity brochures. And then, just as they were ready to build their case, Sierra got a ping on her laptop. An anonymous message. It read, "If you found the hidden file, you're already being watched." Micah looked over her shoulder, eyes narrowing. Attached was a zip file. No subject, no sender. They ran it through a scan. It was clean. Inside was a single document. Its title, Dean's Directive, Do Not Archive. A hidden file is the document titled Dean's Directive, Do Not Archive, was still glowing on Micah's screen when the next rupture in the silence hit. It didn't come with alarms or announcements, just an early morning ripple that quickly turned tidal. At first it was a whisper between faculty members at the law library's coffee stand. By mid-morning it was a quiet exodus from meetings, an avalanche of phone buzzes, and subtle stares exchanged in office corridors. A single damning email had appeared in the inboxes of every faculty member across the department, a message never meant to be sent but one that now couldn't be unsent. The email was a draft, a confidential unsent message, allegedly saved only in Reed's private folder. But now, attached to a faculty-wide listserv, it was very much public. The subject line read, "Langston, Accommodation Progress Update. Private draft, do not send." And the content beneath it was worse than even Micah imagined. It was cleanly written, devoid of profanity, but dripping with disdain and dressed in the sanitized cruelty of academic language. Reeds had described Micah as logistically disruptive and cognitively inconsistent, questioned his obsession with proving his intellectual worth, and even mocked his mobility with the line, "Mobility constraints aside, Langston's martyrdom approach is becoming a distraction to academic cohesion." It wasn't simply insulting. It was institutional execution, dressed as a memo. Micah read it once, then again, and again, every sentence a scalpel slicing through his efforts, his survival, his dignity. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't just Reeds being careless. It was him being honest for once. Yet the university's response was silence. Reeds issued a cold 3-line clarification later that afternoon, calling the leak a breach of internal confidentiality, and the content preliminary, unpolished language never intended for circulation. He never addressed Micah directly. He never apologized. And still, not one administrator responded with outrage. The mystery surrounding the email's leak only added to its power. There was no trace of how it had been forwarded. No staff member claimed responsibility. It didn't come from a known address, yet there it was, echoing across campus servers, burning through the carefully maintained image Reeds had cultivated for decades. Some faculty, visibly uncomfortable, avoided Micah in the hallway. Others offered stilted glances, as if unsure whether to acknowledge what they had seen. Still, no one confronted Reeds. No one challenged him. The system flinched, but didn't move. Micah didn't go public. He didn't post screenshots, didn't rage on forums, didn't demand statements. He sat quietly, absorbing the storm, knowing the next move wasn't to scream. It was to document the email, the silence, the evasion. It all became another receipt in the ever-growing archive that had started as survival and was now evolving into something surgical. He knew Reeds would retaliate. It wasn't a question of if, but when. A summons came 2 days later, cloaked in formality. Performance evaluation. Standard language. The kind of review that had buried students before him. Micah arrived at Reed's office alone, his wheels humming softly across the polished floor. The room was as cold and impersonal as the man standing inside it. Reeds didn't sit. He didn't offer a seat. Instead, he waited until the door was closed before stripping away every veneer of professionalism. What followed was not a conversation, but a calculated dissection. Reeds delivered a quiet monologue, layered with threat, but wrapped in plausible deniability. He spoke of standards, appropriateness, and respect for academic hierarchies, but the intent was unmistakable. He questioned Micah's mental fitness, his integrity, his presence. Reed suggested withdrawal would be dignified. He implied that persistence would only undermine future opportunities. He didn't yell, he didn't curse, but his voice carried the weight of a system that had never been challenged from within. Micah sat still, absorbing the performance like a seasoned witness. He didn't respond, he didn't interrupt, but beneath his jacket, inside his lap, his phone sat recording every word. Quietly, legally, precisely. The same man who had always operated in shadows had finally spoken in light, and now it was captured forever. Micah could feel the shift. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every student Reeds had wounded with words, every career he'd quietly derailed, every silent cry for justice buried under administrative protocol. As he left the office, Micah felt a strange calm. Not relief, not victory, but clarity. He wheeled past portraits of Harvard's most celebrated minds, each one framed in gold, each one complicit in their own silence. The campus around him buzzed, oblivious to the fact that a decades-old shield had just cracked. Reeds had confessed without realizing it, and now Micah held the truth, in 44 megabytes of raw, unfiltered evidence. He returned to his dorm without ceremony, uploaded the file to 3 different drives, labeled it simply, Reeds, recording. Then he pressed play, just once, and listened to the words again. I always win, no one believes you. But for the first time in Harvard's long polished history, someone did believe him. Micah had proof. Micah presses record on his phone, and what Reed says next could destroy him. Micah had always understood the language of silence. The way institutions retaliated not with raised voices but with misplaced emails, sudden technical failures and shifting shadows behind polite smiles. But after the recording of Reed's private monologue was captured and secured, something deeper and more insidious began to stir, something darker than humiliation. This wasn't personal vengeance. It was a system flexing its muscle in silence, determined to remind him that power here did not bleed, it buried. It started with an unread email. Then, too, Micah had submitted a written response for a class assignment, one he'd spent 12 hours preparing, complete with citations and supporting materials. He received no reply, not even a submission receipt. When he checked the portal, the assignment box was marked, not submitted. He thought it was a glitch, so he resented. Then again, this time CCing the teaching assistant, and copying himself. Still nothing. No acknowledgement. And then the feedback arrived. 0. No submission received. At first he questioned himself. Had he missed something? Had he made a technical error? But then it happened again. And again. 3 different classes. 3 separate assignments. The same silence. The same not received message, stamped across his submissions. The next hit came through an academic alert. An automated message, sterile in tone, informed Micah that he was at risk of falling below the GPA threshold, required to maintain academic standing. The notice was cold, clinical, but the implication was scorching. 1 more missed assignment, 1 more low grade, 1 more infraction, and he would be on academic probation. Micah sat in the library's 3rd floor silent zone, the alert glowing on his screen. The timing wasn't coincidental. The moment he recorded Reeds, the machine had awakened. But this wasn't just about one professor anymore. It was coordinated, strategic. The message was unmistakable. Challenge us and we'll erase you in the system. He looked around the room at other students, buried in books and spreadsheets, blissfully unaware that within the same institution, a different syllabus was being written for him. One that rewarded silence and punished survival. But Micah wasn't unarmed. He had already started preparing. Months ago, even before Reed's public humiliation, he'd created a private backup system, a cold encrypted archive of every assignment, every syllabus, every submission receipt, and every time-stamped version. He had documented every email he'd sent, and every instance of faculty failure to respond. For every technical glitch, he had a mirrored record stored safely on offline drive. Still, the weight was growing. It wasn't just about defending his grades. It was about staying alive within a machine programmed to expel those who didn't assimilate quietly. Academic probation wasn't just a mark, it was a muzzle. It was how the institution whispered to the world. He wasn't good enough. That whisper was spreading. Micah noticed a shift among some of his classmates. Where there had once been pity, Now there was distance. Students who had nodded at him in the hallway now looked away. The ones who had messaged him support after the email leak had gone silent. Rumors, it seemed, traveled faster than receipts. Whispers of grade inflation and special treatment swirled beneath anonymous forum threads. Even his success was now framed as dishonesty. But just as the pressure began closing in, a crack in the wall appeared. A message arrived through an encrypted, private academic platform Micah rarely used. The sender had masked their identity, but the content was unmistakable. It was a screenshot of a grading portal, one that showed Micah's assignment marked as received 5 days prior to being declared missing. Attached was a short note: "You didn't imagine this. They're playing with your timestamp." The file had metadata. It was real. Someone was inside the system, watching and helping. Micah studied the data carefully. Whoever sent it had access to internal grading servers, or at least knew someone who did. This wasn't a student. It was someone closer to the faculty. Maybe a TA, maybe an administrator. But someone had seen what was happening and had decided to break ranks. The next morning, another email arrived. This time from a masked Proton Mail account. Attached was a spreadsheet containing 3 weeks of grading logs from one of Micah's core courses. His name was highlighted in red. Next to it, manual override tags. Dozens of them. They indicated human interference, not technical error. Micah stared at the file for over an hour, his jaw clenched. This wasn't sabotage through ignorance. It was digital manipulation. Faculty, or someone they had instructed, had altered his academic record, and the system showed no flags, no alerts, no warnings, just silent tampering. He printed the spreadsheet, locked it in his encrypted drive, and backed it up to 2 off-site locations. He didn't trust Harvard's cloud storage. Not anymore. But even as he built his defense, he knew the attacks weren't over. That afternoon, he received an official summons from the Office of Student Conduct and Academic Review. The letter accused him of violating course policy through repeated submission irregularities. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. If found in violation, he would be placed on academic probation. If he failed to recover within a semester, he would face expulsion. Micah held the letter in his hands, its edges sharp as a blade. Everything was moving faster now. The system had realized it couldn't break him in the open, so it was starving him behind the scenes, in bits and bytes, in submission logs and policy loopholes. But then an unexpected tremor. A message leaked online, just hours after Micah received the summons. It wasn't from a student. It wasn't from the administration. It was a recording, blurry and distorted, but unmistakable. An audio file from a private faculty Zoom meeting. The voices were clear. They were discussing Micah. They were planning a response to escalating behavior. They were discussing strategies to protect the department's public image. One voice mentioned flagging his academic record, subtly to avoid legal risk. Another warned of the optics of expulsion, suggesting instead to pressure a voluntary withdrawal. The recording was only 3 minutes long, but it was enough. Enough to confirm what Micah had always known. They weren't just trying to fail him. They were trying to erase him. A secret audio clip from a faculty Zoom meeting leaks, and it's all about Micah. The audio leak changed everything. For the first time since Micah had arrived at Harvard, the illusion cracked. People who had once kept their heads down now lifted their eyes. It wasn't courage, exactly. It was recognition. A slow, painful acknowledgement that the machine wasn't malfunctioning. It was running exactly as designed. But something about Micah's endurance, his unwillingness to disappear, had become a spark. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady. And sparks, even small ones, could set dry systems on fire. It began in the quietest corners of campus. The custodial staff, usually invisible in early morning hours, started to greet Micah with silent nods, longer glances. They didn't ask questions. They didn't offer platitudes. But they noticed, and they remembered. Some of them had cleaned offices after meetings that left shredded documents in trash bins. Some had overheard faculty conversations they weren't meant to hear. And some had seen professors who claimed colorblindness flinch when passing a black student in a wheelchair. The first real act of rebellion was subtle. A bathroom mirror message written in dry erase marker. "We see you." No name, no symbol. Just 3 words that Micah noticed while washing his hands late one night, long after the library had closed. It could have been anything, a coincidence, a message for someone else, but deep down, he knew better. Then the TAs followed. Teaching assistants, overworked and underpaid, had always lived between two worlds. They weren't students, but they weren't fully protected by tenure either. Many were international, many were women, and more than a few had spent years watching professors like Reed's operate unchecked. One TA, whose name Micah didn't know, began slipping notes into his returned assignments, short confirmations that his grades had been manually changed after they had been entered. Another sent a timestamped screenshot of the grading system, showing that Micah's original marks had been higher before being flagged for review. Micah didn't know who to trust, but the evidence began to pile up. Quiet rebellion had turned into quiet resistance. Even faculty weren't immune. A junior professor from another department passed him in the hallway and dropped a folded syllabus into his lap. Inside it was a highlighted line in a course policy: classroom integrity must not be weaponized. The gesture was subtle, but the meaning was loud. Micah had spent months documenting injustice, building files, organizing data. Now the university itself was leaking against its own walls. Whispers turned to witness, doubt turned to data. And one morning, as rain soaked the cobblestone paths between the buildings, Micah opened his student mailbox and found something he never expected. A manila envelope. Thick, sealed, no return address, no markings. Inside were 27 printed pages. At first he thought it was a prank, another anonymous threat. But then he saw the headers: department memos, redacted email threads, faculty meeting summaries. Some were years old, some were from just weeks ago. All of them referenced Reed. The content wasn't just damning, it was irreversible. There were emails in which Reed described certain students as too politically charged to pass. A memo referencing acceptable attrition among non-traditional admits. A private discussion between two senior faculty members, debating whether a student's disability advocacy crossed into academic disruption. In one email, Reed himself had suggested blacklisting a former student from postgrad fellowships, warning colleagues that activists don't make good legal scholars. Micah's hands shook as he turned the final page. A sticky note was attached. It read, "Use this before he uses you." There was no signature, no hint of origin, just a warning, a call to act. Micah placed the papers into his encrypted archive and sat in silence. Around him, the campus moved on, unaware that its most protected corner had just been breached. He knew what he held wasn't just evidence, it was ammunition, and the people who had provided it, janitors, assistants, quiet faculty, had risked everything without asking for anything in return. It wasn't loud, it wasn't revolutionary, but it was enough. The rebellion had begun. A note inside reads, "Use this before he uses you." The manila envelope sat on Micah's desk like an exposed nerve, daring him to act. For days, the campus had quietly pulsed with leaks, whispers and soft rebellion, but nothing compared to what he now held. 27 pages of internal memos, redacted communications and faculty exchanges that revealed not just wrongdoing, but orchestration. The warning note, "Use this before he uses you," no longer felt like a suggestion. It was a demand, a threshold, a moment from which there was no return. The morning Micah decided to go public, the sky over Harvard was gray, a flat, heavy color that felt like the world holding its breath. Sierra had spent 2 nights drafting strategies, building a timeline, organizing evidence into a narrative that could withstand scrutiny. She knew what the press would ask, what Harvard would deny, and how quickly institutions could twist a story into a misunderstanding. But Micah wasn't seeking pity. He wasn't looking for outrage. He wanted clarity, truth stripped bare, outside the university's curated wall. By noon, the iconic steps outside the Warren building were packed. Reporters from local stations arrived first, followed by regional networks, and eventually national outlets that covered civil rights and education. Cameras lined the walkway like a trial corridor. Students gathered on the grass, some curious, some anxious, some already recording with their phones. Harvard administrators tried to maintain distance, hovering at the edges, as though the scene unfolding on their campus wasn't about them at all. Micah moved to the top step with a calmness that felt unnatural even to him. He wasn't used to being seen, not like this, not as a symbol. His wheelchair became a quiet anchor as he positioned himself before microphones arranged by volunteers from student organizations who had joined in solidarity. Behind him stood attorneys from a civil rights nonprofit, their presence a shield against the institution that had underestimated him one too many times. As the cameras began to roll, the energy shifted. Micah's silence before the first flash was powerful enough to command the moment. The crowd settled. Even the wind paused. His story, carried by the documents behind him, became larger than the humiliation in a classroom, larger than the altered grades, larger than Reed's. It became a reflection of what black disabled students had endured at elite institutions for generations. Erasure disguised as rigor, hostility masked as standards, and retaliation veiled as policy. He presented his experience without theatrics. No anger, no raised voice, just a clear, steady recounting of the months of silence, sabotage, and institutional pressure. The evidence spoke for itself. The leaked draft email, the timestamps on altered grades, the internal memos discouraging investigation. And then, with a quiet resolve that rippled through the crowd, he shared the handwritten note from the anonymous ally, though not the name, reminding the world that resistance had grown roots in the very places Harvard believed it controlled. The press conference transformed Micah from a student into something else, a symbol, a case study, a source of collective recognition. Reporters documented every detail. Photographers focused on the contrast between Micah's calm posture and the storm gathering around him. Students who had once walked past him without acknowledgement now saw him as the voice they had waited for, the one who refused to disappear. But with visibility came retaliation. Within hours, Harvard released a statement. It was cold, polished, and strategically worded, crafted to acknowledge nothing and protect everything. They referred to Micah's claims as ongoing concerns currently under careful internal review, a phrase designed not to admit wrongdoing, but to reassure donors that control remained intact. They praised their commitment to diversity and academic excellence, while never addressing the substance of the accusations. The statement ended with a line that sounded harmless to the uninformed but chilling to those who understood institutional code. We will respond formally once all facts are verified. Micah understood immediately. Institutions never verified facts. They buried them. By evening, the backlash began. Anonymous online accounts resurfaced, claiming Micah was weaponizing disability, or seeking attention, or undermining the institution for personal gain. Rumors spread that he was planning a lawsuit for money. Whisper networks painted him as unstable, exaggerating, dramatic. Some claimed he fabricated evidence. Others resurfaced old, manipulated clips of the classroom incident to undermine him. But something had changed. Micah wasn't alone anymore. Students who had once stayed silent now spoke openly about their own experiences with hostile faculty, inaccessible learning environments, and administrative dismissal. Marginalized staff members quietly shared his press conference with colleagues. Even some junior faculty, though not openly supportive, sent private messages expressing gratitude for what he had done, acknowledging that he had risked what many of them could not. Still, Harvard moved faster than anyone expected. The morning after the press conference, Micah received an email stamped with the official seal of the Office of Academic Standards and Integrity. The message was long, formal, emotionless. It informed him that due to concerning patterns of academic inconsistency and potential violations of professional conduct expectations, a disciplinary case had been formally opened against him. He read it twice. The accusations were vague enough to be flexible, but targeted enough to be dangerous. They cited his submission irregularities, the very ones caused by the tampering he had evidence of. They referenced concerns raised by faculty, without naming anyone or providing dates, and the final line, sharp as a blade, stated that failure to appear at the hearing scheduled for the end of the week would result in an automatic ruling. He checked the timestamp. The hearing was in 72 hours, 3 days. Harvard wasn't going to investigate him. They were going to remove him. The press conference had made the institution defensive, and institutions, when threatened, didn't retreat. They retaliated. Micah closed his laptop slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his bones. He had moved from silent student to public voice in less than 24 hours. Now the institution that had pretended he didn't exist was preparing to crush him openly. But he wasn't the same student they had underestimated. He had allies now. He had evidence. And he had 72 hours to turn truth into protection. The school files a disciplinary action that could expel him within 72 hours. After the press conference, the nation looked at Micah Langston, but most still didn't see him clearly. Media outlets framed him as brave, resilient, even inspirational. But what they missed was the strategy. They saw a disabled black student fighting for dignity, but not the tactician who had been building this case, bite by bite, for over a year. His wheelchair was visible. His pain was visible, but the precision of his intellect, the part of him that had been quietly dismantling institutional armor in the shadows, remained unseen. Micah had learned to code long before he came to Harvard. Through countless sleepless nights where physical pain made rest impossible, he had taught himself how to write code, manipulate databases, and design encryption systems, not to impress anyone, not to stand out, but because in a world that rarely offered accessibility, he had learned to build his own tools for survival. What started as a personal skill had become a form of self-defense, and now it was his weapon. As the university escalated their retaliation, moving swiftly to initiate a disciplinary process designed to discredit and expel him, Micah went deep into the back-end systems Harvard itself had forgotten. While the university's official servers were fortified and monitored, Micah understood something that most IT departments overlooked. Old code never truly disappears. Somewhere buried beneath the polished interfaces and updated portals were legacy systems, neglected, unmonitored, and vulnerable. Using access credentials he discovered in the leaked faculty documents from the manila envelope, Micah logged into a dormant server architecture last used nearly a decade ago. What he found was a digital fossil bed, unarchived faculty folders, administrative messages, and raw grading logs that hadn't been wiped or encrypted. It was a neglected corner of the university's data infrastructure, left open by oversight and arrogance. And inside it were secrets. He moved carefully, backing up everything he touched, building out mirrored drives to protect himself. Within minutes, he found traces of grading manipulation, dating back several years. In case after case, he saw student grades that had been manually lowered after the official deadlines. The patterns weren't random. They targeted the same kinds of students over and over, those who were outspoken, those with disabilities, and those who didn't match the traditional Harvard image. Many of the students had withdrawn mid-semester or disappeared quietly. Some had received letters citing performance issues without explanation. Now the digital trail revealed the truth. They had been pushed out. Professor Reed's name appeared again, and again, not just as a participant, but often as the initiator. But what's more disturbing was that he wasn't alone. At least 4 other professors had made similar alterations. 2 of them sat on disciplinary committees. This wasn't one man's prejudice, it was systemic malpractice. But then Micah found something else. A folder labeled Faculty Privilege Exceptions. Inside were memos detailing accommodations granted to professors facing repeated student complaints. These memos didn't go through the ethics review board. Instead, they were processed privately, allowing faculty members to continue teaching while student reports were resolved administratively. There was no accountability, no public record, just quiet erasure. And then, buried under the layers of folders, Micah saw a file that froze him. It was labeled NDA level only, do not print. He opened it. It was a scanned 8-page legal document titled Non-Disclosure Agreement, Dean R. Llewellyn, Faculty Oversight 2017. The first paragraph alone was devastating. A former student had filed a complaint, naming Reed's and 2 other professors for retaliatory grading, sustained hostile conduct, and discriminatory classroom practices. The university had settled. The student agreed to withdraw the complaint and never speak of the incident again. In return, Harvard promised to seal the records permanently and issued a financial payout. The agreement had been signed not just by legal counsel, but by the dean himself. Micah read the clauses slowly. The document prohibited disclosure of the misconduct. It blocked future students from ever accessing this case. The system wasn't just broken. It was actively engineered to silence dissent. The final line was written with clinical cruelty. Disclosure of this agreement will be considered a breach of institutional integrity protocol. The weight of it landed heavily. Micah had exposed Reed's. He had uncovered tampering, bias, manipulation. But now he saw the full truth. The university hadn't failed to protect students. It had protected itself. Strategically, legally, financially. He encrypted the document and backed it up to multiple secure locations. Then he printed a redacted copy, sealing it in an envelope marked only with Sierra's initials. What he had just found was no longer about proving his own innocence. It was about proving the institution's guilt. Micah stared again at the dean's signature.
There it was.
In blue ink. On the final page. The same hand that had shaken donors. The same hand that had published statements about inclusive excellence and equity commitments. That hand had signed away justice, bought silence, and buried truth. He leaned back, the screen's glow still flickering in his glasses. The world saw him as the student who spoke out, the student in the chair, the face of protest. But they hadn't seen this side of him yet. They hadn't seen the side that had mapped the institution's skeleton from the inside out. They hadn't seen the side that had watched systems, cracked them, and left trails of encrypted truth in places no one expected him to reach. The disability was visible. The genius was not. And now, he was ready to use both. One of the files contains a non-disclosure agreement signed by the dean. Micah Langston understood something most people never would. Being seen wasn't the same as being understood. After the press conference, he had become a national headline, a face framed in sympathy, a story wrapped in soft outrage. But the coverage had missed the point. It saw his wheelchair, but not his precision. His pain, but not his planning. He had never been just a student fighting injustice. He was a strategist, and now he was preparing for war. He didn't just post in hope. He released in waves. His first move was subtle. A post made anonymously through a verified student group's private academic forum began circulating. It showed anonymized data from grading logs. The post exposed trends, how students from marginalized backgrounds had been quietly penalized, their grades reduced post-submission, often flagged without justification. There were no names, no dramatic claims, just data, cold, clean, and surgical. It spread rapidly. Within hours, screenshots appeared on social media. Education watchdogs, student organizers, and alumni influencers started building threads and explanations. TikTok turned the scandal into fast, digestible content. Activists tweeted timelines. Reddit threads decoded grading language. And while the university maintained silence, the silence itself became part of the accusation. The question wasn't if Harvard had failed, it was how long it had been allowed to get away with it. Then came the second wave. Micah released a carefully crafted PDF titled Institutional Patterns of Retaliation at Harvard. It included redacted faculty communications, altered grade metadata, and system screenshots showing evidence of interference. The report didn't accuse, it documented. Within a day, it appeared on every major student server, faculty Discord, and education subreddit. News outlets began quoting it. Micah's story stopped being personal. It became procedural, structural. The story wasn't about one student. It was about a pattern. Micah wasn't done. The third wave hit like thunder. He released part of the non-disclosure agreement. Not the full version. He redacted names and payout details, but enough to prove its existence. It bore the dean's signature and referenced sealed complaints. The image of the agreement, one line blurred but the words hostile academic environment, clearly visible, went viral in hours. Harvard was no longer facing a student. It was facing its own paper trail. In response, the university released a vague, legalistic statement. The documents were incomplete, unauthorized, and potentially misinterpreted. They didn't deny the signature. They didn't deny the NDA. And that silence was louder than denial. Reeds disappeared the next morning. His office emptied, his name erased from the department roster, his biography removed from the school's official site. No email, no explanation. The institution erased him the same way it had erased complaints, quietly, without accountability. But Micah was only halfway through. He knew the institution would try to paint him as reckless, as an activist with no regard for procedure. So his fourth wave was the most strategic, a spreadsheet of quiet withdrawals. These were cases where students were pressured to leave for personal reasons, often after reporting faculty behavior. The spreadsheet didn't include names, just patterns, dates, outcomes, departmental memos, combined with testimonies from past students who anonymously confirmed the sequence of events. It shattered the illusion of isolated incidents. The system hadn't just failed students, it had built mechanisms to silence them. Then in a moment no one saw coming, a tenured professor resigned, publicly. Her letter, short and blistering, stated that she had watched these patterns for years and had remained silent out of fear. She thanked Micah for his courage, admitted her complicity, and left her position without asking for applause. Her resignation went viral. Harvard's veneer cracked again. The cracks deepened when a well-known donor, infamous for past racially charged remarks, announced they were ending their relationship with the university. Their statement blamed Micah for creating division. It accused Harvard of bowing to pressure. The backlash was swift. Students ridiculed the donor. Faculty distanced themselves. Harvard, trying to contain the damage, issued another soft, non-committal statement about external voices and internal matters. Micah didn't respond publicly. He didn't need to. His silence had become strategic. He let the outrage build organically. He let others spread what he had exposed. Behind the scenes, he focused on legal preparation for the disciplinary hearing. Still scheduled, still hanging over him like a final threat. But he wasn't isolated anymore. Civil rights attorneys, tech whistleblowers, and data analysts began offering support. His case wasn't just emotional. It was mathematical. It was legal. It was undeniable. Then came the unexpected twist. 3 days into the media storm, a small, unmarked envelope arrived at Micah's door. No name, no return address, just a flash drive and a yellow sticky note. Scrawled on the note were 7 words. "This got me blacklisted. It's your turn now." Micah plugged it in. A former student sends Micah a flash drive marked, "This got me blacklisted. It's your turn now." The flash drive arrived like a whisper from the past, delivered in silence but screaming with consequence. Its unmarked shell, its scratched edges, and the single handwritten note, "This got me blacklisted. It's your turn now," were heavier than any press conference Micah had faced. This wasn't support. It was a passing of the torch. Whoever had sent it had lived through the same machine Micah was now tearing down. They hadn't survived to speak, but they'd survived long enough to send a warning, or a weapon. Micah plugged the drive into an isolated device, disconnected from the internet, shielded from surveillance. A folder appeared. Audio evidence. Inside, 10 audio files. No descriptions, no labels, only timestamps stretching back 6 years. A hidden archive of everything Harvard had spent years trying to bury. The files weren't metadata or logs. They were voices. Words spoken in offices, retreats, faculty lounges, places where policy wasn't debated, but decided. He played the first clip. The voice was unmistakably Charles Reed's. Sharp, arrogant, dripping with entitlement. It wasn't a classroom lecture. It was a candid moment, a private conversation not meant for public ears. Reed's discussed entitlement among accommodation students, mocked the concept of learning equity, and dismissed disability requests as coddling weakness. Micah's breath caught as Reed said plainly, "ADA makes it hard to weed out dead weight. But I've got workaround." The next few files dug deeper. They weren't just offensive, they were evidence. Recordings of Reed's coordinating with assistants to grade black students more harshly to test their readiness. One recording revealed a conversation in which Reed's discussed pushing a female student of color out of the program, stating she was too activist to be academic. In another, he bragged about crafting exams intentionally inaccessible to students who used assistive technology, noting that if they can't read the text, they don't belong in the discourse. Every file was another blow, not to Micah's spirit but to the mask the institution had worn so well. These weren't rumors. They weren't complaints filtered through hearsay. This was Reed's, unfiltered and unafraid, describing his role not just as an educator, but as a gatekeeper, deciding who passed and who vanished. But the final file shattered everything. Dated October 2019, it was captured in a more relaxed setting. Clinking glasses in the background, low laughter, and the kind of casual cruelty only spoken when people are sure no one is listening. Reed's was at the center, holding court. He discussed complaints like minor distractions, framing them as part of the job. Then he said it, the line that dropped like a hammer on Micah's chest. "I've buried complaints before. No one survives my class if I don't want them to. They just don't know how many folders we delete before anyone asks." The laughter that followed was unrestrained. Other faculty members in the room, voices Micah recognized from department meetings, chuckled and raised glasses. One said something about reputation management. Another joked, "That's why we love tenure." Micah paused. The recording. Not from shock. He had known it deep down. But hearing it, confirmed and preserved, stripped away the last layer of disbelief. This wasn't about one man abusing his power. This was about a system that had normalized abuse, rewarded it, and protected it through silence. The emotional weight of what he now held was colossal. These weren't just files. They were buried screams. They were shattered academic futures, bottled into MP3s. Students who had dropped out, transferred, disappeared. Micah could now connect them to dates, recordings, comments. He was no longer tracing patterns. He was holding proof. He backed up the drive to multiple encrypted servers. Then, for the first time, he cried. Not from pain. Not from fear, but from the unbearable realization that everything he had suspected was worse than imagined, and every step he took from now on would be met with even greater resistance. But the university wasn't wasting time either. The very next day, Harvard's Board of Overseers released a statement through internal channels. It was brief, sterile, and chilling in its clarity. They would conduct a closed-door inquiry into recent events, emphasizing confidentiality, institutional standards, and administrative discretion. No students would be involved. No outside observers permitted. They called it a sensitive review, and the final decision would be made without public release. Micah read the statement again and again. It wasn't just a dismissal of his evidence. It was a message. We are going to bury you next. They were protecting themselves. Not the truth. Not the students. Not the integrity of the institution. The phrase closed door wasn't protocol. It was strategy. The same strategy that had been captured on the recordings. The same voices now hiding behind legal shields and HR language. Micah opened the final file once more. The line echoed, "I've buried complaints before." But now, one of those complaints was talking back. He began assembling a digital folder titled Board Package. It contained all 10 audio files, indexed and timestamped, supported by grade logs, metadata, and the redacted NDA. He crafted it the way a lawyer builds a case, and an activist builds a revolution. Precise, irrefutable, and powerful. Each element layered with intention. This wasn't just evidence, it was leverage. Then, buried in one of the recordings, he heard it. A subtle but revealing phrase. Reads, while advising a faculty intern, had said, "That's the Langston protocol. Overwhelm early, discredit by midterms, and let the pressure do the rest." Micah froze. He wasn't just a target. He was a method. His experience had been turned into a repeatable tactic, a blueprint for erasing students who questioned authority. What had happened to him wasn't accidental. It had been rehearsed, tested, scaled. That was the moment he stopped feeling like a victim and began thinking like a disruptor. Harvard's board thought their closed-door review was the final act. But Micah had no intention of waiting for a verdict. He had the one thing they didn't, the voices they thought were hidden. And he was going to use them, not with anger, but with precision. The war wasn't over. It was just entering their boardroom. Harvard's board announces a closed investigation, but Micah plans to crash the meeting. Micah's laptop glowed in the darkness of his small dorm room, long after midnight, its screen a portal into a world he'd never thought he would breach. The folder labeled Board Passage sat open, its contents stable, encrypted and waiting. He had never expected to attend the board meeting, not officially. The invitation was not for him. But tonight, with a quiet breath and a borrowed Zoom link handed over by an unlikely ally, he was about to crash the highest-level conference Harvard had convened in weeks. In the low hum of his wheels on the carpeted floor, Micah reminded himself, this isn't about him anymore. This is about every erased name, every silenced student, every discarded record hidden beneath polished stone and legacy banners. The Zoom window opened. A dozen small boxes flickered to life. The dean, board chairs, senior faculty, legal counsel, and in the center, a blank placeholder for those not connected. That placeholder was supposed to be empty, invisible, unseen, but the hidden backdoor link had placed him there. His face did not appear, only a name, Guest 0923. The position was strategic. His audio muted, video blank. Anonymous, safe. For now, he leaned forward. The meeting began. The dean's voice, smooth, measured, institutional, rolled out like it always did. Structured, composed, authoritative. Discussion centered on recent allegations, institutional integrity, and reputation risk. The senior faculty representatives spoke of damage control, stakeholder fallout, and donor relationships. One after another, they recalibrated their concern, not for justice, not for students, but for money, prestige, and power. Names like Langston or Micah never surfaced. He was the issue, the disturbance, the liability. The language was sterile, unfeeling, calculated. A legal counsel quietly recommended a swift resolution, craft a narrative of non-academic misconduct, frame the missing assignments, modified grades, and submission irregularities as administrative errors or student negligence. Then proceed with disciplinary hearings. They would portray the violations as breach of academic conduct, easy to argue, harder to defend. One board member suggested waiting until end of term, giving time for public outrage to fade. Another proposed a voluntary withdrawal clause, masked as compassionate concern, giving Micah the chance to leave quietly with minimal record. Micah's heart pounded so loudly, he feared the sound would betray him even through the headphones. This was what he had feared, the machine moving in secrecy, in whispers, deciding not just his fate, but the fate of any student who dared challenge its foundations. The betrayal would be methodical, hidden, irreversible. He pressed record. In the moment he did, something unexpected happened. In the corner of the screen, the placeholder label flickered. The zoom grid shifted. One box detached, another appeared. The guest 0923 tag vanished. In its place, Micah Langston. A hush froze the meeting before it had begun. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then cameras turned. Faces twisted. The dean's composed mask cracked. The legal counsel stuttered. Senior faculty leaned forward, eyes restoring the power he had taken from them. Whispers erupted even through the digital sound limits. Some tried to disconnect, others hit mute. But the recording had started. The world outside would hear, even if they silenced him now. Micah stayed still. He didn't speak. He didn't apologize. He didn't beg. He simply watched them scramble. The men and women who had built reputations on legacy, lineage and privilege, confronted now by their own words. He let the recording run. Minutes stretched. The longest minutes of his life. He saw the dean's face change, from calm authority to panic. He saw Reed's empty slot. No face, no voice, just a screen name gone silent. He saw the legal counsel swap notes furiously, lean over to the junior staff, point to screens, whisper. The attempt to frame as administrative error collapsed in real time. The suggestion of voluntary withdrawal hung like a betrayal even to their own values. And in that moment, they knew the board had lost control. Micah ended the meeting. He closed his laptop. He did not exhale. Instead, he leaned back, letting the shock settle in his bones. The weapon had been pressed at them, and they panicked. By morning, the university had already responded. An email landed in his inbox. Immediate suspension of scholarship, pending review. The words were cold, clinical, devoid of empathy. He had been suspended, without hearing, without explanation, without recourse. His housing grant froze, his stipend halted. His access to campus systems revoked, scholarly routine replaced by uncertainty. But the blow had another layer. In dorm halls, glances shifted. Whisper campaigns swung back. He was now the student who had broken rules, attacked faculty, exposed sensitive internal proceedings. Even allies hesitated. The air that had felt supportive yesterday felt thin, charged, dangerous. Inside him, something else stirred. Not fear, not regret. Determination. The knowledge that they had exposed themselves, that their plan to bury him had failed, because he had dragged them into the light, and the same light would burn the lies they had built. He reopened the audio folder. He started preparing his next move, because this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice, and justice required exposure. Full exposure. Reed's threatens a defamation lawsuit, and Micah's scholarship is immediately frozen. The scholarship suspension hit harder than any email, meeting, or manipulated grade ever had. It didn't just remove Micah's financial lifeline. It stripped away his stability, his housing, his identity as a student, and the only semblance of normalcy he had fought to keep. At first he read the message twice, then a third time, hoping it was an error. But the stark red banner in his student portal confirmed everything. Benefits frozen pending investigation. The room around him felt suddenly too small, too quiet, too sharp. The world that had held him for years had decided, with a single administrative click, that he no longer belonged. Micah's days changed instantly. His housing contract, tied directly to his scholarship, entered review status. That silent phrase meant eviction could come with 24 hours notice. His disability support services, previously flexible and responsive, slowed to a crawl. Emails came late, or not at all. Appointments were pushed back pending formal clarity. He became a visitor on his own campus, tolerated physically, rejected institutionally. For the first time since arriving at Harvard, Micah felt homelessness creep toward him like a slow shadow. Meanwhile, the smear campaign intensified. What began as whispers in anonymous forums ballooned into carefully seeded misinformation. Posts accused him of fabricating evidence for attention. Others claimed he was manipulating disability accommodations to avoid coursework. Fake screenshots circulated, alleging he had bullied teaching assistants. A few accounts even accused him of hacking the university. Ironically close to the truth but twisted into a criminal narrative instead of survival. The worst part wasn't the lies. It was how easily people believed them. Even some classmates who had once nodded at him in hallways now looked at him with tight lips and hardened eyes, unsure what was real. It wasn't just students. Media outlets began running sensationalized headlines, focusing more on the Zoom infiltration and less on the years of retaliation. One article framed him as a disruptive activist jeopardizing the university's reputation. Another described him as mentally fragile, a phrase so loaded with coded racism and ableism that Micah felt his breath catch. He didn't respond. He couldn't. Any reaction would feed the narrative they were crafting, one that portrayed him as unstable, dramatic, unreliable. The weight of it all, the silence, the loss, the coordinated framing, pressed into him day by day. Nights became long stretches of stillness, where he stared at the cracked ceiling, trapped between exhaustion and fear. Without his stipend, he rationed the food left in his room. He skipped meals to stretch what little he had. He disconnected his heating unit. One night, when he realized his room's electricity charges might be reviewed, his wheelchair battery, expensive, essential, flickered toward low power. He worried for the first time. What happens if it dies? What happens to me then? He reached a point of near collapse the day he received a notice from campus housing, informing him that his placement would be temporarily reassigned pending outcome. The language was cold, detached. It didn't say eviction. It didn't have to. He packed a single duffel bag with the essentials: charger, hard drive, medications, and the flash drive evidence. Everything else he left in neat folders on his desk, unsure whether he'd ever see the room again. That night, Micah wheeled himself to a quiet corner of campus, a stone bench behind an old building where students rarely passed. The air was sharp with the cold, and his chest felt heavy. For the first time, he let himself wonder whether the institution would win after all. Power had been designed to survive truth, and Micah was running out of time, strength, money, and will. He hadn't cried in weeks, not even when the recordings played back the darkest parts of Reed's abuse. But that night, beneath the dim glow of a campus lamppost, he finally broke. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Just a slow, quiet collapse of breath. The kind that comes from carrying weight no one sees. When he finally returned to his dorm, he prepared for one last night before packing whatever he could carry into the unknown. But as he opened his door, his phone buzzed. Once, twice, then non-stop. Message alerts stacked faster than he could tap. He ignored them at first, assuming another smear thread had surfaced. But then one notification stood out. A classmate's name he hadn't expected to see. Then another. Then a professor. Then someone he didn't know. And another. Sierra called, her voice breathless. Urgent. Micah answered, expecting bad news. Instead, she told him to check his email. His heart pounded as he opened it. A subject line flashed. Micah, we did this together. He clicked. A GoFundMe link appeared, and beneath it a number. A number so large he blinked twice to be sure it was real. Tens of thousands of dollars raised overnight, not by one person, not by a small group, but by hundreds: students, faculty, alumni, strangers from across the country who had heard his story. The fund description was simple: housing, food, legal support, help Micah keep fighting. He scrolled through the names, each one a lifeline: the barista from the cafe he always visited, a janitorial staff member who had nodded at him in passing, a former classmate who had transferred departments quietly years ago. Messages accompanied the donations: affirmations, apologies, gratitude, and fierce encouragement from people who had watched silently until now. Micah stared at the screen, overwhelmed. Not by the money, though it meant survival, but by the power of collective recognition. Harvard had tried to isolate him, starve him, bury him, and the world had responded by lifting him higher than he could have imagined. For the first time in days, his breathing steadied. Hope didn't arrive as a shout. It arrived as hundreds of quiet gestures, forming a wall he had never expected. By morning, the fund had doubled. By afternoon, tripled. Offers of temporary housing poured in. A retired professor volunteered her guest room. A disability rights researcher offered accessible transport. Someone from across the country offered to ship a spare wheelchair battery. Every message carried the same undertone. Don't stop. We're here. Then, just when Micah thought the tide had reached its peak, another email arrived, short, direct, and bearing a name he recognized only from national civil rights cases. A major law firm, one that had argued landmark discrimination cases before the Supreme Court, wrote that they were prepared to represent Micah. Pro bono. No fees. No conditions. Total backing. They wanted Harvard, and they wanted Micah to let them fight. He read the email twice, feeling the shift not just in his future, but in the entire balance of power. Harvard had taken away his scholarship, but now he had something far more dangerous. A legal giant on his side. A major civil rights law firm offers to take on Harvard, pro bono. The morning sun in Cambridge cut through frost-tinged windows as Micah rolled into the narrow street outside the legal building. The air felt brittle, like the brittle silence that hovered over what was meant to be a legal proceeding. Structured, controlled, authoritative. He parked his wheelchair on the padded mat at the entrance, inhaling once, deep and slow. He didn't know whether this was the courtroom where the university would defend itself, or a trial chamber where his fate had already been decided. But he was past fear now. He had evidence, he had truth, and he had the steel-thin resolve of someone who had nothing left to lose, except silence. The waiting room was antiseptic, beige walls, plastic chairs lined in rows, fluorescent light humming overhead, the kind of place that pretended professionalism could sterilize history. No walls here would contain what was coming. Micah watched faculty members drift into the room, pale-faced, briefcases in hand, hollow apologies in their posture. Among them, someone he recognized, the legal counsel, whose voice had once advised sweeping non-academic misconduct under administrative error, the same voice that had drawn up the voluntary withdrawal clause. Their eyes flicked over him briefly. Disbelief, disgust, fear, the kind that comes when the predator senses the net is closing. But he didn't flinch. He clicked open his encrypted drive one last time. The folder labeled Board Package It gleamed on screen like a loaded file waiting to detonate. Once inside the deposition room, the door shut behind him with a weight that felt final. He wheeled forward until he reached the long table, polished oak, cold and godlike, beneath portraits of alumni whose names he'd heard in visitor tours, scholarship pamphlets, donor plaques. Their faces looked down at him, as if to judge. Across from him sat the dean, flanked by legal counsel and two anonymous board members, whose expressions were carefully neutral. The air smelled of stale carpet and worn leather seat, the kind of smell that suggested these walls had swallowed silence for decades. The recorder began. Every minute, every sigh, every breath counted. Micah felt the microphones lean toward him. He opened his laptop. On screen, he loaded the evidence. First the altered grade logs, then the time-stamped files showing submission overrides, then the memos detailing faculty privilege exceptions, and finally the audio recordings, the private admissions, the closed-door faculty meetings, the laughter after confessions too terrible for public ears. Each file was a crack in the facade. Each file a veiled accusation made real. The tension thrummed in the small room. It wasn't hostility or aggression. It was the weight of a legacy being challenged. Quietly, irreversibly. One of the board members cleared his throat, eyes flicking to a folder on the table. The folder might have contained the official stance, the prepared defense, the carefully penned retorts lined in legal jargon. But for the first time, the folder felt hollow. The silence hung long, expectant, heavy, waiting for denial, for excuse, for deflection. What followed instead was stillness. Then recognition, the kind that drove fear into the deepest buried corners of privilege. As the evidence flicked across the screen, the dean's composure cracked imperceptibly. The practiced smile slowed. The legal counsel's pen paused. The board members shifted in their seats. Their neat distance, their polite posture, betrayed by the shifting lines of dread on their faces. The air changed, colder, sharper, a sound of fabric rustling, of chairs scraping. Nothing harsh, nothing loud, but the room had stopped breathing. For the first time, the institution felt vulnerable, exposed. Micah closed the folder, but didn't log off. He leaned back slightly, not triumphant. Calm, controlled. He didn't need to speak. The files had spoken for him. The screen still showed the NDA bearing the dean's signature. The altered grade logs with names redacted but patterns obvious. The audio file, with reeds whispering about burying complaints before they surface. The document trail was cold, indelible, undeniable. This was not one man's mistake. It was decades of erasure, compiled in ones and zeros, now unmasked. A board member reached for the recorder spreadsheet. Their finger hovered over the pause option, but didn't press it. The desperation in their eyes, careful mask slipping, told Micah more than words ever could. They were caught, not in rhetoric or rumors. In fact, in files, in voices, in time-stamped acts of cruelty. What the institution had spent years sanitizing, they had just watched fall apart on a screen. And no code of conduct, no legal buffer, no donor letter could shield them now. Micah shut the laptop. He sat back. He bowed his head briefly, not in defeat, but in resolve. There was no triumph yet. This was a turning point. The line between student and institution had blurred. He had become the living record of their decay. The recorder continued clicking, capturing every faint breath, every shifting chair, every gulp of air the once mighty took when confronted with their own archive. He wheeled out. The door closed behind him. The echoes of glass sliding shut felt like a verdict. When he emerged into the hallway, it was empty, cold, pale, as though the building had exhaled after holding its breath too long. He didn't look back. He didn't pause. Each wheel rotation carried him further from that room, but also into the future that now bore his name. By the time afternoon sunlight cut through the windows of his dorm room, he had already sent encrypted copies of the deposition video to legal counsel outside Harvard, to civil rights media trackers, to student watchdog groups. He didn't trust the institution not to rewrite the record. He didn't expect mercy. He expected reaction, and proof preserved in multiple independent servers. But the retaliation came sooner than he anticipated. His university account went dark. Email, library access, financial aid portal, even the disability support login, all frozen. In its place, a terse message, temporary suspension pending review. The language was antiseptic, vague, designed to intimidate without admitting wrongdoing. The message carried no warmth, no explanation, only the weight of institutional power collapsing around him. But along with the freeze came whispers, in hallways, on anonymous platforms, from emboldened voices, newly released from fear. Suddenly, people were talking. Former classmates, faculty who had stayed silent, custodial workers, TAs, staff, all privately admitting they had known, seen, observed, not spoken. Now they whispered apologies. Support, confessions of regret. The breaking of the facade had cracked something deeper than policy. It had cracked silence itself. Late that evening, as Micah sat alone by a window overlooking the campus courtyard, lights reflecting softly on the frost-lined stone, his phone buzzed with a single message from his attorney. "You just changed everything." He closed his eyes. Not relief, not triumph, but a cold, steady certainty. The institution had spent centuries building walls. Tonight, they began to crumble. The attorney leans in and says, "You just changed everything." The morning of what the world would call his graduation day began not with caps and gowns, but with headlines, tweets, news alerts on phones and TV screens across the country. The suit of headlines and bylines had replaced the mortarboard, but for Micah Langston, it felt heavier, more real, more earned. Nights of sleepless coding and silent suffering had led here. Months of public shame, legal hearings, digital warfare, and now, reckoning. The campus, once a labyrinth of privilege and polished facades, opened its gates to what could no longer be hidden. He arrived at the old chapel building before dawn. The steps were bathed in gold light, not the light of commencement ceremonies, but the dim glow of media floodlights and camera rigs. Alumni from previous rites streamed past carrying bouquets, diplomas and cameras. Students in academic robes posed for snapshots, but Micah's arrival was different. He wheeled forward, head held steady, eyes calm. On his lap was not a diploma, but a leather portfolio filled with hundreds of pages. The deposition transcript, redacted NDA, grading logs, memos, audio files, and a final letter, a settlement agreement from the university leadership. It bore no fellowship, no congratulatory seal, but enough signatures to guarantee change, enough leverage to force institution-wide reform. Behind him walked a small group, civil rights attorneys, a few student leaders, janitorial staff who'd quietly backed him, a couple of former classmates, and a journalist from a national paper who had promised this story ends today. The group was silent, not anxious, not emboldened, quiet, like granite about to crack. They entered the chapel quietly, the old wooden door creaking as if in warning. People turned heads, whispered, some gasped, others fumbled for their phones. The air shifted. The aura of centuries-old lineage and entitlement was replaced with something unfamiliar and dangerous. Accountability. Inside, the stage was set, not for a graduation hood ceremony, but for a public reading and reveal. A long table faced what used to be the student seating area. Behind it sat new board members appointed in light of the crisis. Teachers, civil rights advocates, student body representatives. Among them was a former disability rights advocate turned interim dean. A step-down leader who had quietly replaced the man whose name once proclaimed prestige. On seats reserved were dozens of students, faculty, alumni, many from marginalized communities whose stories echoed Micah's silent exits. Abandoned promises, lost scholarships. Cameras were there too. Not just press but live streams, social media coverage, hundreds of phones capturing the moment. Micah wheeled to the microphone. At first he didn't speak. He stared at the assembled faces, scanning the crowd. The fear, the curiosity, the resignation in some, the hope in others. Behind the board, a massive screen flickered on. The first slide. Institutional accountability, files of inequity, complicity and silence. The once invisible documents began to scroll. I-reports, grading logs, memos, emails, audio excerpts. The hush was immediate. The century-old chapel seemed to lean in. The lights dimmed. The polished wood benches creaked under shifting weight. The reading didn't last long before murmurs began. The kind that rippled quickly, unplanned, unstoppable. Faces paled. Some averted eyes, others stared, frozen. A few tried to stand, but seats rattled as everyone moved, drawn to the screen like moths to flame. A faculty member gasped. A formerly respected senior professor's hand flew to his mouth. Someone's phone had begun recording. Another newscaster's red live icon blinked in the corner of the screen. Then, a hush. Not the calm of silence, but the weight of it. The kind that carries guilt, history, regret. The interim dean, newly appointed, newly under scrutiny, stood slowly. He cleared his throat. He didn't have to announce it. The crowd already knew. The board's oral statement followed. Full review of disability accommodations, mandatory bias training for faculty, creation of an independent oversight committee, with student staff and alumni representation, a promise of redress funds for affected students, transparency in grading logs, and most of all, an official apology, not for inconvenience, for erasure. Upstairs in an unmarked office corridor, a cardboard box was quietly handed to someone whose name had once symbolized power. Inside were two things, a resignation letter and a black briefcase containing proceedings, internal emails, memos, media strategy plans, defamation drafts. The man walked out swiftly. No interviews, no statements, just a silent exit. His parking pass left on the desk, his keyed ID card deactivated. The network of privilege had been unplugged. Outside in the courtyard, dozens gathered, students from diverse backgrounds, many of whom had once walked the campus with bowed heads, now stood upright, arms around each other, not in celebration, but solidarity. Faculty who had once tutored quietly, now spoke openly to cameras, recounting years of turning blind eyes. Union contract workers, janitors, staff, those often invisible, held printed signs reading, "We see you. We were there." It was not a protest. It was recognition, a collective exhale. Micah rolled down a long path lined with arches and brick, the crowd parting around him. Not in exclusion, but reverence. Reporters shouted questions. Flashbulbs popped. A young student shouted his name. A parent from out of state filmed him, but he rarely glanced at them. His eyes were on something else. The classroom building where it all began. The lecture hall, where he had been told he didn't belong. The seat where his wheelchair once elicited cold pity. The desk where others wrote with pens, he with pain and perseverance. Months later, the university's new policy measures rolled out. Disability accommodations were formalized, enforced, made transparent. Faculty reviews, previously protection for legacy, became public, with student and peer evaluations included. Grading logs automatically archived, immutable, accessible to students. Anonymous reporting lines established, guaranteeing outside legal oversight. A scholarship reinstatement program was launched for students whose records had been altered. Names blacklisted, blackball checks, quiet withdrawals, each record reopened. Letters of apology sent. In many cases, reinstatement or postgraduate support offered. The institutional rot was cleaned slowly, methodically, with oversight. Micah received a letter. Congratulations on your restored status. You are cleared to graduate. He didn't reply immediately. He let the words sit, the weight of them, the meaning. He had come full circle. Graduation day. Real commencement arrived in late spring. The campus green was festooned with banners. Students laughed, families huddled in chairs, caps tossed. The sun was warm, but the breeze still carried a chill, the kind that speaks of change, of new seasons after long winters. When his name was called, Micah wheeled forward, tassel swinging back, the crowd rising. Some cheered, others held tears. Among them were janitors who cleaned his dorm corridors, teaching assistants who had slipped him hidden screenshots, faculty who had quietly supported him, former classmates, civil rights attorneys, reporters, all bearing witness. His diploma was handed to him, not as charity, not as victory, but as right. A slip of parchment that meant access, not apology. As he stepped off the stage, the applause echoed not just for him, but for every student who had learned to stay quiet too soon. But the day offered one more twist. Weeks later, the university restructured its curriculum. One of the first moves. The lecture hall once occupied by Professor Reeds was officially decommissioned for lectures under his name. Instead, a new course titled Ethics, Access and Law was announced, to be taught by none other than Micah Langston. The course description emphasized accessibility, systemic bias, and institutional accountability. Students registered in droves. Campus press releases framed it as Harvard's commitment to a new academic era. On the morning of his first class, the classroom was full, more than capacity. Chairs lined the walls, cameras discreetly set up in corners for accessibility live streams. Students holding notebooks, laptops, tablets, people of every color, gender, disability status, background. And at the front, instead of the podium Reeds once used, there stood a simple unadorned desk. Beside it, Micah's wheelchair, backed up by quiet applause, not pity, recognition. He wheeled in. The room fell still, not out of shock, but respect. The light streaming through tall windows carved shadows on the floor, cutting across history, across legacy, across pain. In that silence, the weight of everything he had endured, dismantled and rebuilt, pressed gently on his shoulders. He paused, long enough for the room to absorb the gravity. Then he began. His voice calm, clear, firm, the voice that had always belonged there, but had been denied. And his first words echoed off the ancient walls, bouncing across generations of expectations, prejudice and denial. I was told I'd never be here. Let's begin. If you've ever been told you weren't good enough because of who you are, if you've seen silence used as a weapon more than words ever were, then you know this story isn't just Micah's, it's all of ours. Type yes if you believe truth can't be buried forever. Subscribe if this broke your heart and opened your eyes.